Hello, and welcome to today's APO Productivity Talk. I'm Kentaro Enno from the Industry Division of the APO Secretariat based in Tokyo. The APO is an intergovernmental organization promoting productivity, fostering innovation, and enhancing competitiveness in its 21 member countries in the Asia-Pacific region. The topic of today is greening the COVID-19 response, recovery, and redesign. While COVID-19 has caused tremendous socioeconomic loss and suffering, it has also opened opportunities to create a more environmentally sustainable future. Today's presentation will deal with the planning framework for that sustainable future. The three experts from the Institute for Global Environmental Studies, IGES, will introduce the new framework and apply it to sustainable consumption and production, or SCP, and biodiversity. In 1996, APO developed the concept of green productivity, which refers to the application of environmental management systems, tools, techniques, and technologies to reduce the environmental impact of an organization's activities while simultaneously enhancing productivity and improving quality. The topic of this session is closely related to this green productivity. Today, we are honored to have three speakers from IGES. Thank you very much for your joining us. IGES is headquartered in Japan and conducts innovative policy development and strategic research on the environment, which assist in making political decisions on ways to achieve sustainable development, both in the Asia-Pacific region and globally. The first speaker today is Dr. Eric Zusman, the research leader in the Sustainability Governance Center of IGES. He has conducted research on environmental issues in Asia for most of the past 2 decades. The second speaker is Mr. Andre Mader, a conservation biologist who specializes in international biodiversity policy. Matthew Hengesbaugh is the third speaker, whose presentation will focus on SCP and the circular economy. All three are among the co-authors of Implication of COVID-19 for the Environment and Sustainability, published by IGES in May this year. Today's presentation will cover the new planning framework for a sustainable future and its applications in the wake of COVID-19. After the presentations, there will be a live question and answer session. Viewers, please post questions with your names and countries in the live chat box, and we will answer as many as time allows. Andre, I'd like to ask you to start, please.
Yes, thank you, Anderson, and thank you very much for having us. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be able to talk about this important subject. You can go on to the next slide. Actually, I'll start on the following one. So when we spoke about putting this presentation, the seminar together, we decided that it was important to address biodiversity and humankind's relationship with nature, because that is where all of this started, all of this trouble started with COVID-19. So I'd just like to give you a little bit of a background there, and then also talk about some of the implications. So first of all, as you can see on this slide, COVID-19 is one of very many zoonotic diseases. Zoonotic disease is nothing new at all. It's been with us basically since humankind has existed. And it includes all different kinds of organisms. So we're very familiar with the fact that COVID-19 is a virus, but other zoonoses are bacterial in origin. Some are protozoans, which are single-celled organisms. And then some are even multicellular organisms. So, for example, hookworms, tapeworms, that kind of thing. And the symptoms and the problems that the implications that they have for human health are regarded as zoonoses as well. And then on the next slide, I have just listed what I would regard as, this is purely from a personal point of view, the most well-known zoonotic diseases to my mind, and I think most of those listening will recognize most of these. And just to indicate that there is a variety of origins here, and in brackets behind each of them you can see what the vector is. That's the creature, the animal that carries the pathogen. So the plague has, of course, been with humankind for hundreds of years and has caused incredible damage. We know how to control it now. It still is an issue, but we have the means to deal with it now. So it's less of an issue than it was when it was wiping out large swathes of Europe and Asia's populations. And then other familiar ones are rabies, which is carried by dogs, also a virus. SARS, you'll be familiar with from not so many years ago, another virus carried by palm civets and bats. Another virus is bird flu, H1N1, which was carried by ducks and chickens, domestic ducks and chickens, but probably spread by wild ducks to the domestic ducks. And then swine flu is another virus, of course, carried by pigs, which is also fairly fresh in our memories, I think, or many of us. Lyme disease is one which is locally very important, and in the US, perhaps more than anywhere else, it's been publicized as being a huge issue. That's a bacteria, not a virus. And then malaria is an extremely well-known zoonosis, one which is caused by a single-celled protozoan parasite and carried by mosquitoes. Dengue fever is another virus carried by mosquitoes. Ebola is another virus, but various different animal species have been identified as vectors. And then toxoplasmosis is one which I think many people will also be familiar with, another protozoan parasite, which is carried specifically by domestic cats and to some extent also wild cats. So this just gives you some idea of the sort of range of zoonotic diseases and how broad they are and how long they've been with us. And there are many, many more, but this is the 10 that to me were most familiar. And then if we could go to the next slide, please. So very often the question is asked, how did this all happen? And also, what is nature's link with zoonoses like COVID-19? Now, human beings used to be very much a part of nature, living in small communities, very much separated from each other across the planet. We are now much less a part of nature. There are many more of us, but we are much more separated from nature. So whereas in the past, we would have been exposed to zoonoses at a local scale on a continuous basis, I've written there constant exposure would have meant to some extent some adaptation to those viruses, but not necessarily adaptation. They may well have wiped out small populations, but in some cases, populations may have adapted to them. And then certainly because zoonoses would have been localized, because we lived in very small communities that didn't travel very far, because of that, there was a limit. So when zoonotic disease did affect a community, it might have been isolated to that community, even if it did completely wipe out that community. But then over time, we've become more urbanized and certainly more globally connected. And as a result, our exposure to zoonoses and the animals that carry them has been far less constant. So when we do suddenly become exposed, we may be more vulnerable. And then we are, of course, now much more globalized, which means that transmission can happen far more rapidly, orders of magnitude more rapidly than it could have happened before. And that's what we've seen with COVID-19. Next slide, please. So unfortunately, although we need to understand this disease very well, I think one of the troubles that we've had is that there's been a sort of what's been termed an infodemic that has accompanied the pandemic of COVID-19. We didn't understand things terribly well at the beginning. There was all sorts of speculation. And then, of course, institutions and even individuals around the world and media and all the rest of it started churning out enormous amounts of information about what happened, how it started, what to do about it, etc., etc. It's been a very dispersed kind of response. And this is problematic because response requires sorting what's likely from what's unlikely. And I don't say certain from uncertain, because we can never be entirely sure of how these things happen and how they move. But there are some things that are likely. For example, that bats are involved in transmission of COVID-19. The transmission to human beings happened at a wet market in Wuhan. This is probable. And the transmission involved the harvest of wild species. So if the virus was caught at a wet market in Wuhan from bats, then certainly harvest of wild species was involved. What's maybe a little bit more disputed is that pangolins were involved. Pangolin is another species of mammal, which also happens to be very highly threatened across the world. All 8 species are highly threatened. But there have been some recent papers speculating that pangolins may not have been involved at all in the transmission of the virus. And then there's some unlikely information as well. For example, the rumor that labs or rogue labs were involved in the transmission of the virus and the escape of the virus into the human population. And then there are other facts which are perhaps arguable. And one of those is that habitat destruction is to blame directly for the transmission of the virus. It's certainly evolved, but there are some sweeping statements like that that are made that perhaps require a little bit more detail and explanation before arguments can be built upon them. And then I have one more slide before I hand over to my colleague. No, I don't. Sorry, that's later on. So we know now that we need to be more careful about our interactions with wild species, but there's a lot that we don't know for sure. And after my colleagues have spoken, I'll return to the topic of biodiversity and outline how we might want to handle things differently in future, starting with improving our understanding. And with that, I'd like to hand over to to Eric, who will talk about something called the RRR planning framework.
Okay, thank you so much, Andre. That's greatly appreciated. And as Andre mentioned, I will be talking about what IGES, my organization, is calling the RRR or New 3 Rs planning framework. And those 3 Rs stand for respond, recover, and redesign. And I will outline some of the key components of this planning framework. And before I do so, I just want to highlight that one of the core considerations that needs to be made as different policymakers consider what to do about COVID and looking past COVID to other potential pandemics, is they need to make sure that there's a strong scientific basis for the decisions. So many of the points that Andre raised about COVID's origins and this infodemic feed directly into this idea of a planning framework, in that the framework assumes that we're drawing upon the best and most robust evidence base for our decisions, and that should feature prominently in our planning. Okay, now what I'd like to start by doing is talk a little bit about the rationale for this planning framework. And some of the key points to recognize as we outline that rationale is that many countries have already adopted policies and allocated significant amounts of resources to help manage the wide-ranging impacts of COVID. Some of these are very direct impacts, and as we've seen, especially in terms of the environment, some have been a consequence of some of the lockdowns that we've experienced because of COVID. Now, there's an important opportunity here to ensure that these policies and the resources that have been allocated not only address some of these more immediate impacts, but also set us on a path to a more sustainable and resilient future. So at IGES, we do a lot of work on what are called the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs. And these are a set of 17 goals that are supposed to help us move to a more sustainable future by 2030. And unfortunately, what we've seen from the time that those goals were adopted in 2015 is much of the progress in terms of achieving this sustainability has been quite limited, and actually we've seen some regression this year, in part due to COVID. And what I want to also suggest is, in order to make more progress moving forward, we need to make sure that the goals and the outlooks of these different policies and the resource allocations, they need to be coherent, they need to fit together well, and they must be forward-looking. And unfortunately, and I'll highlight this as I move through the presentation, a lot of the decisions that governments are making tend to be quite the opposite. And this will lead me to the next slide. Can I switch to the next slide, please? Okay, now what I want to suggest then is, as we've analyzed many of the decisions that governments have made, is that many of those decisions, if you put them all together, they tend to be rather piecemeal and short-sighted. Many of them are dealing, of course, with some of the immediate impacts of COVID, but they're not necessarily looking at maintaining some of the positive environmental impacts that have come, for instance, from reductions in pollution into the future. In some ways, they've also moved in the opposite direction. And so we see countries that are allocating resources, for instance, from COVID stimulus packages, not only for what we would call green industries, such as renewables, but also for brown or fossil fuel-driven industries, and not always focusing, for instance, on efficiency gains or job creation, which would be more in line with the Sustainable Development Goals and the missions of IGES. Further, there's not always strong links between some of the more narrower interventions, so some of these immediate interventions, and Matt will talk, for instance, about medical waste in this regard, and some of the long-term structural and systematic changes that we want to see that would help retain some of the environmental improvements that have been achieved in part due to some of the economic changes. And so what we're arguing here at IGES is, in order to make sure that policymakers are moving forward in a more sustainable, resilient direction, that there is better alignment with the different components of our COVID planning frameworks, and that those different elements not only are aligned by theme, thematically aligned, but over time, so they're going from short-term to long-term, and then also over space, so that we don't have some regions that are, for instance, moving in a more sustainable direction, while others backtrack or backslide. Can go to the next slide, please. And what I'm calling this sort of lack of coordination and this sort of more piecemeal, short-sighted approach, this is an example of what we call policy incoherence. And perhaps the clearest indication so far of policy incoherence can be illustrated by this figure right here. So this is from what we call the Energy Policy Tracker, and it's an initiative that is run by 11 different research institutes, including IGES. It's overseen by this IISD, or International Institute for Sustainable Development. And basically what we've done is looked at the stimulus packages and to what extent the resources from those stimulus packages are being spent on greener interventions and browner, or in this case, you can see blacker interventions. And as you can see from this diagram, as we look across the different countries here, and these are the G20 countries, you can see that there's a split between some of the green and the darker interventions. This is at a very high level illustrative of this lack of coherence. And so this lack of coherence is problematic and is a type of thing that suggests that we won't get necessarily this sustainable and resilient future that we hope for. Can I go to the next slide, please? And so now I'd like to give a sort of more concrete example of this lack of coherence, and to highlight some of sort of the negative example of what we'd hope that countries don't do, and why we're suggesting a need for this triple R or new 3Rs planning framework. And this comes from, fortunately, my home country, which is the United States. And it comes from this CARES Act, which is the large piece of legislation that the United States adopted after COVID became extremely serious in the country. And that piece of legislation has a little of this sort of patchy or marbled look to it. I mean, there's some pieces of it that are green. So for instance, we see on this seesaw type of diagram that there is tax relief for renewable energy projects that are written into this legislation. But there's also changes to tax restrictions and rebates for fossil fuel industries. There's also changes in lending to small and medium-sized enterprises, but these are enterprises that tend to focus on more traditional brown industries. We also have some illustrations of changes in the ways that public lands are used. So this doesn't only apply to the energy sector. And then there's also related regulatory rollbacks for some of the fossil fuel industries. Now, these provisions are put in there in the name of relief for some of the key industries and in an effort to sort of jumpstart the economy. But what we would argue, and I think there's a lot of evidence to support this, is those might be sufficient temporary stopgap measures to jumpstart the economy. But even in the medium term, this is not going to take us in a sustainable direction and could prove more costly down the road and then greener or more far-sighted progressive policies and measures. Okay, so this then gets me to the next slide. Can we move to the next slide, please? So then let me talk real briefly about the sort of core elements or the building blocks of this triple R planning framework. As mentioned previously, there's three separate categories here. There's respond, recover, and redesign. And the respond elements focus primarily on targeted interventions that are aimed at addressing the immediate environmental and livelihood impacts from COVID. And a lot of times here we're focusing, on the health impacts, of course, as well as possible underlying causes, including environmental causes. And I would also put in sort of our respond box here an effort to recognize some of the desirable environmental impacts of COVID, not in a way necessarily. So for instance, we've seen air pollution reductions because of some of the lockdowns. So we're not necessarily counseling that the economy should stay locked down, but rather a way to start recognizing some of these improvements so that as we move into the recovery building block, we can help retain those improvements in a sustainable manner. And so that moves me into the recovery building block, where we're talking more about reforming broader policies and also redirecting some of the fiscal stimulus resources to sustainable, resilient policies and investments. And here the idea is that we're moving at a broader scale, of course, and a lot of the emphasis here is on the fiscal stimulus. As I showed previously from our energy policy tracker, a lot of those resources are being allocated in ways that are not purely green, and that will lead to suboptimal outcomes in at least the medium term. And then this leads me to the redesign element. So recovery is focusing on broader policies, and the fiscal stimulus is a key pivot point. Well, redesign is focusing on changing the systems, so the energy, transport, urban, and socioeconomic systems, as well as the institutions. So by institutions here, I mean both the structures and the rules that govern how decisions are made about energy, about natural resource management. And these institutions exist at many different levels. And they can sometimes be very difficult to see. I mean, they're not as visible, for instance, as a centralized energy grid. But I would argue that in many ways, their impacts are all the more greater, in part because we're not always clearly aware of how these institutions affect our decisions. And my colleague Matthew will get into a little bit of this discussion of how these different systemic challenges help lock in some of the unsustainable behaviors behind consumption and production patterns. Okay, so could I go to the next slide, please? So what we're calling for then is for policymakers to think at the same time of what should fill in this sort of response box, the target interventions to address direct impacts, the recovery box, the sustainable policies and stimulus with a strong environmental or green focus, and then the transformation of our different types of systems and institutions. And this is a lot of times we're focusing not only on systems that have a real direct and clear bearing on the environment, but also some of our social systems. We've seen, for instance, with COVID, a lot of concerns about social justice. And what I would argue is that there's a real opportunity for policymakers to take on both of these challenges, some of the social injustice challenges and some of the environmental challenges, within the same type of institutional frameworks, and in some ways capture the energies from different social groups to drive forward our green transformation or green transition. The ultimate outcome of this, of course, is a sustainable and resilient world. And I'd like to highlight one last point about this piece here. In terms of the outlook of these different elements, so the outlook for the systemic changes has to be short-term, medium-term, and long-term. The response is a little bit more of a short-term outlook, whereas recovery is a little bit more on the medium-term to long-term. But the point I want to underline is, we're very much in the COVID era, and I think it's a little bit perhaps premature to talk about a post-COVID era. But these different elements need to be introduced simultaneously. We can't afford to let unsustainable systems, whether they be institutions or some of the hardware, continue to persist past this time if we want to really achieve a sustainable and resilient future. So we need to work on all three of these simultaneously, even though our outlooks, our perspective on their impacts might be different. Okay, can I go to the next slide, please? And then I'd just like to highlight a few reasons why we're putting forward this framework. And for colleagues out there that work especially on concrete technologies or are working at this sort of cutting edge of some of technological change and whatnot, these motivations are slightly, how can I say, a little bit more on the conceptual side. But I think it's really important to sort of pair some of our knowledge, technical knowledge, with some of sort of this more conceptual or policy-oriented knowledge. And so the motivations for this RRR framework, I'm going to highlight 2 points here. First is this idea of lock-ins. And so the notion of a lock-in really was conceived approximately 20 years ago or so, when there was discussion initially of what it would take to move towards more sustainable or renewable energy systems. And the idea here was that it was really difficult to do this, not because there's just one perhaps barrier out there to adopting renewables. So it's not just because renewables can sometimes be more expensive, although their prices are coming down these days. And it's not just because of some social barriers that some people might fundamentally not want to have solar panels in their backyard. And it's not just because of institutional barriers, for instance, that the Ministry of Energy has been working with fossil fuel industries for a long time. But rather, it's the combination of all three or even more of these barriers that come together to cohere in a way that makes it difficult for those who are pushing for renewable energy or for more sustainable policies to make progress. I mean, there's a system of barriers that come together that make it difficult to move forward and push forward a transition. And this system of barriers tends to lock in policies and institutions that keep on pushing forward the status quo or business as usual type development. And so to break this lock-in is not easy. Having said that, there's evidence that lock-ins have been broken before. And in many ways, they also require a system of changes. And some of those changes come from what we sometimes call an exogenous shock or a jolt to the system. These can be, for instance, some type of one-off event which helps break up the different institutions and some of the vested interests that have an incentive to keep the current system in place. What we've seen in the world of social science is that the way that this lock-in situation or condition can be broken up sometimes requires this exogenous shock or this jolt. So to give you a concrete example, I mean, of course, the triple disaster of in Fukushima, was a tragedy by from many different perspectives, but it also helped open opportunities for introducing more renewable energy and a feed-in tariff in Japan. And in much the same way, we see some opportunities with COVID, and this is more at not just a national, but even a global level, to help break down some of the interests in institutions which are preventing change. And for this to actually move forward, though, requires changes at multiple levels. So this multi-level transitions theory is an approach that helps to understand the different types of forces that can bring about transformative or significant changes to our systems. And without getting too immersed in the vocabulary, I mean, basically they break up the different types of levels where different forces exist into what is called the landscape level. This is sort of your some of the knowledge and the norms of way things are being done. It also might include some very large institutions. So for instance, international agreements on climate change, what have you. But these type of landscapes can change over time, and they sometimes are changed due to some type of exogenous shock. And then they also talk about at a sort of second level, one level down, what are called regimes. And this is where really your policies, your markets, some of your technologies, this is where they interact. And what I would suggest to you is our 3Rs planning framework fits into this space and sort of in between what are known as the landscapes, regimes, and then the last level at the bottom are these niche innovations. So these are some types of innovative changes that can potentially lead to bigger and bolder changes over time. So my colleague, Matthew, I think in the context of sustainable consumption and production, will highlight a little bit of some of the potential innovations to waste management that might help open a crack for bigger and broader changes. And the key here really is if we have a good planning framework in the middle, it can help align some of the forces from both above and from below to bring about some of the transformative changes that would lead to a more sustainable and resilient future. So I'm going to stop right there, and then hopefully this will lead nicely to a transition to my colleague Matthew, who will talk about the applications of this 3Rs or triple R framework in the context of sustainable consumption and production. Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Eric. It's a pleasure being with you all today, and I appreciate my colleagues, their succinct and eloquent summary of some of the many principles we'll be discussing over the course of this presentation. My name is Matthew Hengesbaugh, and I'll present a little bit on sustainable consumption and production, also known as SCP, which provides an underpinning for much of what we have already discussed and will continue to discuss in the context of the triple R framework. So for starters, let's begin with some definitions. SCP has been defined in multiple ways by many different organizations, but there is consensus around the UN One Planet Network, who defines SCP as systemic change, decoupling of economic growth from environmental degradation, and applying a life cycle thinking approach across all stages of consumption and production. This accounts for all phases of resource use in order to do more and better with less. So here we see that the SCP conceptual definition is closely aligned with these principles we talk about with APO, green productivity, resource efficiency, and circular economy. Essentially, what we're trying to achieve with SCP is to reduce the environmental impact of resource flows at all stages of production and consumption. We're moving beyond linear take, make, waste, extractive models, industrial models, instead to focus on more of a reuse, recover, recycle, and repair type approach. And this is often shortened here in Japan as the 3Rs, reduce, reuse, recycle. Many, I believe, will be familiar with this. Again, just in line with APO's very well-established definition of green productivity, here by SCP, there is an aim to improve total factor productivity and overall environmental performance. And I'd like to emphasize here that because SCP extends over multiple time horizons, as I'll get into a moment, it encompasses all aspects of this RRR framework, including response, recovery, and redesign. And I'll touch on this as well in a moment. Next slide, please. So here, I'd just like to give you some conceptual framework of SCP. You can see by this figure right here that it is a holistic type of approach. It extends beyond just the material extraction stage through to production into the end use stage of consumption. And it both comprises upstream and downstream supply chains. And I'll give you some specific examples of this in the context of hazardous waste management in one moment. Next slide, please. But let's put this in context of the RRR framework that my colleague Eric just illustrated, starting with the response. Now, here we're going to talk a bit about waste management and pollution control. Now, let's put this in context. Before COVID-19, it was found that approximately 2 billion people worldwide lacked access to waste collection services, and approximately 3 billion lacked controlled waste disposal facilities. So it's critical, of critical importance for us to ensure that waste collection, transportation, and disposal is conducted with minimal health and safety risks to ensure that COVID-19 does not become a further challenge, particularly for industrializing countries. Now, as we all know, COVID-19 has also led to a significant increase in the production and disposal of many kinds of healthcare waste. This extends from gloves to masks to hospital gowns, etc. And as I will further point out, beyond the hazardous waste, we've also seen multiple increases in other kinds of waste streams resulting from changes in consumption patterns. Now, it's important also to underline that given existing public health concerns, many people are now opting for single-use plastic. And this goes against some recent progress that has been made in terms of minimizing those plastic waste flows. A number of countries have imposed bans, for example, and restrictions on the use of single-use plastic. There is now being significant rollbacks of those in the wake of COVID-19. And as a result, there's been also some interruptions to waste management, provision of waste management services and recycling activities from the coronavirus outbreak, particularly with regard to the handling of plastic waste. And this has brought on additional challenges for the waste management industry across many countries as a result of being burdened by this increased demand and disposal of the single-use products. Now, let's talk a little bit about the generation of hazardous medical waste to give you a better example about some of the challenges we now face. Hazardous medical waste, healthcare waste, has grown considerably, particularly at the city level. Local authorities across all countries are now making many efforts to contain the health crisis, and they're faced as well, on top of this, with a emerging waste management crisis as well. Some examples here, in Wuhan, China, some recent data suggests that waste there had increased from approximately 40 tons a day to 240 tons a day during the pandemic. And there has been some other studies that suggest there are comparable increases across other multiple cities in Asia. Just to give you some examples, in Manila, pre-crisis pandemic, there was it was found to be about 47 tons a day of healthcare related waste. Now that has increased a huge amount, surged to about 280 tons a day. Bangkok provides another case in point. 27 tons a day of waste before, following the health crisis, 160 tons after. And as I've already emphasized, this has put enormous pressure on already resource-constrained waste management systems at the local level. Now, the accumulation of single-use medical waste This is going to require both immediate and, in many cases, a kind of reconfigured approach to the treatment and disposal. Going back to what I mentioned about SCP a moment ago, we're looking at all phases or all stages of the waste management cycle, starting from generation through to treatment and disposal. So it's important to highlight here that, and I will talk about this in detail a bit later in my presentation, but source segregation is one of the most important stages where some of those changes to our waste management systems can and should occur. Now, I'll tell you the reason for that is coronavirus. Recent data has identified that the COVID-19 virus is still found to be active on plastic after 72 hours. So it's important to prioritize some of these SCP actions, starting at not only the source generation or segregation of that source waste, but across the storage, transport, treatment, and disposal. Some immediate actions that can be taken on by countries, particularly in the developing world, include addressing open dumping and burning, and halting the mixing of potentially contaminated waste with other waste streams. This virus-laden waste often still lingers on discarded face masks, gloves, and other biomedical waste, and should be separated from the regular waste stream, which might cause those potential health risks. So again, we need to emphasize the proper management of existing treatment and recycling facilities to address those adverse effects. We can talk about this a bit later, perhaps during Q&A, but I'd like to raise several examples now of some best practices in the treatment of hazardous waste. Most widely used methods would be use of incineration, for example, although there are some built-in challenges from the setting up of incineration plants, especially if they are done in a slapdash or haphazard way. The other examples include the upgrading of sanitary landfill sites and the use of autoclaves, which is also a form of steam sterilization of said waste. There are a number of other examples, but perhaps we can talk about that in more detail later. So while we've seen an increase of healthcare or medical hazardous waste, we've also seen, as a result of the pandemic, increase in many other forms of waste and pollution. Other waste streams include packaging waste, for example, residential waste, and related energy emissions, particularly as those consumption patterns and transportation and other kinds of work habits have changed. So these lockdowns associated with the pandemic have led to increases in certain kinds of waste, but also reductions, comparable reductions in other waste streams. And I'd like to give a couple of examples here from the commercial and transport sector. There has been some findings that COVID-related lockdowns have resulted in significant reductions in commercial and industrial waste. For example, in China, it has reported a decrease in the amount of waste within large and medium cities by as high as 30%. And some of that data also plays out across a number of other cities around the world. Another important area to highlight here in terms of reduction of waste and pollution is with regard to air pollution. Many cities around the world, particularly in India, as you'll see in a moment, have witnessed dramatic drops in their air pollution, leading to a much more healthier increase of air quality. And so ultimately, I'd like to sum up by saying that as resources may be very limited, particularly for waste management services in developing countries, and oftentimes in industrialized countries as well, it is imperative to find and identify those opportunities for cross-country learning, particularly on the safe and affordable treatment and disposal methods for medical, healthcare waste, and other types of pollution control. Next slide, please. Just to put this into context, you can see here, these are two before and after photos from New Delhi. You see that the top corner there, right before the crisis, you could see quite significant haze and pollution in New Delhi compared to immediately after. And with regard to also wastewater, you can see there on the bottom also So there were significant decrease in the wastewater pollution. And this provides an important reminder to us that these pollution abatement efforts need to be carried forward to ensure that gains in environmental quality can continue and remain. Next slide, please. So here we get into the recovery phase, which might also be termed as investing in building back better. I'm sure many of you have heard this turn of phrase, especially now in the wake of the crisis. Now, Eric spoke about very earlier in the presentation about how stimulus measures provide an important opportunity to enhance funding for innovation. And I'd like to emphasize here that a key driver of productivity and economic growth, sustainable economic growth, we should say, is innovation. Public resources can be redirected towards investment in sustainable resource use, in climate mitigation and adaptation, and other industrial sectors that could be termed as green, renewable energy and waste management among them. Now, this provides an opportunity to improve long-term productivity in our countries, the sustainability and resilience of our supply chains. And as we know, these supply chains are globally integrated, so any area of improvement, whether upstream or downstream, is important for carrying some of those efficiency improvements forward across the entirety of the supply chain. Now, a number of countries have enacted economic stimulus packages in response to COVID-19. Eric highlighted this earlier. And by and large, the financial resources have been directed, however, to unsustainable or what we would call brown activities, rather than being channeled to low carbon, environmentally friendly sectors and industries. This very clearly needs to change. We have an opportunity now to redirect some of that funding towards more sustainable solutions. And by that, I mean we need to be investing in alternatives to emissions intensive or energy intensive activities and work-related pollution. Some of this has happened as a result of the changes in work tech routines and processes. For example, teleworking has become very popular in a number of countries. But these need to continue, and we need to have a real rethink about how we can continue some of these more efficient consumption and production practices to limit the potential rebound effects and lock-ins that may come from recovery to economic recovery to the pandemic. I'd also like to highlight that fiscal stimulus has positive knock-on effects for employment. Particularly in the waste management sector, you could see here on the slide, the International Labor Organization has estimated that as many as 9 to 25 million new additional jobs. Now, these are new and additional jobs, not, jobs that come from a result of changes of routines. These are new induced jobs as well as newly created jobs that can be created from investing in a circular economy. And that's very important to keep in mind when we start thinking about, as I'll talk about in a moment, redesign. Nevertheless, it's important to also recognize that these employment gains require some strategic thinking through the development of specific policy mechanisms, incentives, and institutional reforms to guide the long-term structural changes in our economies, which are so needed. Please proceed to the next slide. Here we'll talk a little bit about recovery in a case example from Cairo, Egypt. Now, as I mentioned, some countries have used that stimulus funding already to carry forward shovel-ready projects focused on pollution abatement and waste management. Here's an example from Cairo, Egypt. A newly launched project with support from the World Bank entitled the Greater Cairo Air Pollution Management and Climate Change Project aims to improve both air quality and address greenhouse gas emissions in the Greater Cairo area. This is a 6-year, $200 million USD project. Here we can talk a little bit about the co-benefits that are generated from addressing both air quality improvement and climate change. The project itself focuses on reducing vehicle emissions, improving the management of solid waste, and strengthening air and climate change decision-making systems. This is happening at the municipal level there in Cairo, but it's also aligned with Egypt's national efforts to reduce both air pollution and climate pollutant emissions in line with the country's greater sustainable development strategy entitled Egypt 2030. Next slide, please. So this sets an important stage for us to discuss a bit about the redesign phase, or how we shift towards sustainability and resilience. This involves building more circular, inclusive, and resilient consumption and production systems in line with this SCP conceptual framework I spelled out earlier. First, it's important to distinguish what we mean between the resilience and sustainability. Resilience in this context refers to, you might be aware of this already, but it's important to emphasize the difference, the capacity of the system to respond to change and develop, to use exogenous or external shocks to spur renewal and innovative thinking. Where on the other hand, when we talk about sustainability, this is much more long-term focus, projecting in the future, the well-being of our future generations and our planet, emphasizing the long-term prosperity, contributing to environmental health and socioeconomic development, and by that, a thriving society, a healthy environment, and a society that also continues to prosper and thrive. As I've mentioned earlier, both of these concepts need to be thought about in both simultaneously, and this requires a collective thinking and strategies across multiple sectors, both public and private, and others, to ensure that our systems do not revert back to business as usual, fall into those lock-in traps, but bounce back stronger and more sustainable over the long term. So let's talk a little bit about waste management again, how to improve the efficiency of our waste management and scale of our waste management services. We need to start thinking about how to integrate more decentralized approaches within the existing municipal solid waste management systems. In line with my mention earlier about policy strategies, this will involve looking at both treatment, recycling, disposal, but moreover, looking at the generation stage, areas for improving source separation of the waste generation in the vicinity of the waste, vicinity of our municipal solid waste management systems, so at the local level. But this helps to reduce, by focusing on a decentralized approach, reduces the burden on waste collection and transportation, and at the same time, significantly reducing the risk of COVID-19 transmission to waste management personnel, whether they're formalized or, in many cases in our developing countries, informalized. So decentralized approaches can be implemented for select types of waste, whether we're talking about hazardous, residential, or what have you, at reduced investment and operating cost to our waste management service providers. It requires, however, integration of different approaches for solid waste management and optimizing existing systems to promote these new approaches, both at the national and subnational levels. So I'd like to close this slide by saying that, again, whether we're working at the waste management stage or we're working early on in material extraction and production stages, we need to be focusing on building robust and localized supply chains to enhance our resource use, address wastage, and help in combating the spread of future pandemics. This will take me to my next slide, slide 8, please, where we talk about redesign. Again, putting this in context of the shifting towards the sustainability and resilience, with 2 additional examples from the local and the regional level. So some examples of countries and regions working to integrate SCP into their redesign strategies include Pakistan. Surprising example here, but Pakistan in that sense is very much ahead of the curve in developing a clean green cities index. This is a far advanced when you compare to, say, some of more industrialized countries who are not necessarily thinking holistically or across all stages of the SCP cycle. Now, this Green Cities Index has been initiated in 20 major cities around the country. It seeks at leveraging multilateral financing to expand not only sanitation services through, say, for example, stormwater management, rainwater harvesting, solid and liquid waste management, but also hospital waste disposal. And now we can compare that to another country that's quite progressive. A region which is quite progressive. A number of countries in the EU, for example, are seeking to scale up investments in recycling infrastructure and imposing an EU-wide tax on non-recycled plastic packaging as part of an economic recovery plan entitled Next Generation EU. The focus here is on reducing dependency on external suppliers to increase the resilience of the global supply chain. And it's part of a larger effort on the part of the EU region to boost innovation by proactively supporting structural change across its multiple member countries. Studies suggest in the EU that the circular economy there could create at least 700 new jobs by 2030, so very much in the short term. With that, I'd like to go back to my colleague, Andre, who will speak a little bit about some of the biodiversity issues and challenges and solutions and take us on home. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Matt. So I'll just take us briefly over the following 4 slides back to nature, so to speak, and to point out the fact that the RRR framework applies very much at the source of issues like this pandemic as well. And if the framework could be well applied there, it reduces the need for applying it further down the line. But redesign in particular needs to include and to consider how to reduce spillover. This is a term which refers to a pandemic making its way from its animal host into a human population, from where it can spread as rapidly as it has with modern transport. And one of the innovative means by which this can be addressed is a new take on buffer zones. And this comes from a discussion I had with an ex-colleague of mine recently, who I asked him, what would a buffer zone look like? Because if you create more forest around the forest, that's unlikely to reduce the chances of transmission. It just provides more place where the hosts can reside. But what he pointed out was that the focus here can be on identifying where spillover is most likely, which is probably communities that live very close to the forest and which harvest species for sale elsewhere, and then to use those as monitoring focal points. So those communities themselves would then act as a buffer and as an early warning detection system. So this is one way in which we can really apply that framework right at the source. And the third point on the slide is just something a little bit of an aside, but just to show you how other issues also come into it. It's speculated also that the treatment of wild animals at wet markets is potentially also a means of transmission, or one of the reasons for transmission. So even the animal rights issue comes into all of this. And in the next slide, if you could just move on to the, thanks. Here I just want to get back to this whole issue of the importance of getting our arguments really watertight, and to build a robust case for conserving nature in response to challenges like global pandemics like COVID-19. And this really means clearly establishing the facts. In this mass information age, it's easier to transmit information, more easy than it ever has been. But because of that, we're dealing with the volume issue of data. And we need to avoid making claims that will discredit us in the future. So we really need to, my final point here is that effort is required to distinguish the facts from the speculation, and to do so really swiftly, because as we've seen in the case of COVID-19, if that's not done in very short order, then it can be too late, and we get stuck in a spiral of having to deal with the virus that we are currently in now. In the following slide, just like to mention a little bit about trade, which is of course very relevant to productivity. We might not think of wildlife trade as being a productivity issue if we're from the developed world, but in many developing countries, the trade of wild species is and always has been a really key source of income to millions of people in local communities, including indigenous peoples who have done it for as long as their communities have existed. But it's important here again to get the facts straight. So zoonotic pandemics will not help to motivate for increased control of threatened species, because threatened species are not particularly well represented as vectors of pandemics. The list that I showed you earlier on, the only threatened species there was the pangolins, which might not even be involved in transmission at all. And it's very likely that there are threatened species that are involved. But again, I think it's important to see the entire discussion and the entire argument for conservation, for example, and not just focus in on very specific aspects. And legislation, there's been some speculation that there should be a complete ban on the trade of wildlife. There should be a ban on the trade of threatened wildlife, and there already are international means and frameworks for that to happen, for example, through the CITES Convention. But if the trade of wildlife as a whole is banned, one thing is that it'll simply increase as an underground trade, so the so-called black market would explode, and legislation would be more difficult. And of course, there are many communities that rely on this as a means of income. Whereas if we focus on regulating trade and on really being clever about how trade is regulated, then the trade of wild species could even be a positive for conservation. And that might seem strange at first, but think about how the hunting industry, for example, has worked in many African countries. It's been a means for preserving ecosystems as a whole, which would otherwise have been developed or agriculturalized or transformed in some other way. So if we get the approach right, we can actually use legislation to our advantage, and as my colleagues alluded to earlier on, build back better in that way. And then I just have one final slide before I hand back to Eric. This is back to the claim that habitat degradation is directly responsible for the pandemic. I think that there have been many publications which have made the statement and then built arguments on top of that. But I think that the public in general need to be better informed about the full range of complexities that are involved in issues like this, like the transmission of zoonotic diseases, and not just to make broad sweeping statements. So, for example, in the case of habitat degradation, it's perhaps more the fragmentation of habitat than the degradation of habitat that is to blame here, because fragmentation increases the porosity. In other words, the surface area of a forest margin, for example, would be increased by the forest being fragmented. Instead of being one big block of forest, if you have a forest which has many roads cut into it and different endeavors being sort of digging into different parts of the forest, then that's going to increase the porosity and the amount of access that people have to the forest. So it's not the degradation per se, but the fact that it increases access. And that I think should be made clear so that people understand precisely what the problem is. But then my last point is that there are also countless other reasons to preserve our natural heritage and its diversity of ecosystems and species. Disease prevention is one ecosystem, so-called ecosystem service, and one way by which the risk of zoonoses may, in many and perhaps most circumstances, be decreased. But nature and ecosystems provide baskets of ecosystem services. It's never just one. A forest, for example, will provide food, it'll provide water purification services, it'll provide timber, and the list goes on. It's a very long list in any ecosystem. And then biodiversity itself, the diversity of species itself, is an incredible source of productivity and innovation to humankind. So there have been tens of thousands of, or not tens of thousands, there have been more than 10,000 patents on products which have taken their ideas directly from nature, from different species. And then there have also been tens of thousands of scientific papers on how medical and other technological innovations have borrowed directly from designs in nature. And so with more than 8 million species on our planet, most of which we don't even know very well, we haven't even named, that just indicates how important it is that we protect this this heritage of ours, not just to help us to deal with pandemics, but to help us to deal with the variety of the development issues that we face as a species. And so with that, I'll hand back to Eric, who's going to sum up for us with a final slide.
Okay, thank you very much, Andre, for highlighting some of the possible applications of this triple R framework, the case of biodiversity, and for underlining the importance of having a clear understanding of both the origins and implications of COVID and their links to biodiversity. I'd like to now close by just pointing to some salient points that were raised during our discussion. So the first one I think is particularly important. This is that prevention is more productive than cure. And so the idea here is that hopefully by taking forward some of the suggestions that we've offered, we can prevent not just COVID type of pandemic, but other future crises, including climate and biodiversity crises. Second point is that it's really important to monitor potential spillover points between different sectors and between different interventions. And this can potentially save not millions or just billions of dollars, but potentially trillions of dollars. And then I want to highlight a little bit more about some of the key points on this triple R framework. We're advancing this framework because we see it as a way to reduce some of these spillover points and also to prevent future crises. And the way that it can do this is by strengthening coherence and consistency of different actions. It also underlines the importance of using freshly allocated resources for not only policy changes, but systemic changes, system level changes to break lock-ins that make it difficult for us to move into a more sustainable and resilient path. And then this triple R framework can be applied to many different policy changes as well as these broader systems, and it can be applied to many different policy areas. So my colleague Matthew went through some of those areas, moving from the case of waste management and medical waste all the way over to the change of sustainable change of our consumption and production systems. And there also are some applications to the case of biodiversity. In order to make sure that countries are adopting this type of framework, it's important to address skill needs, finance, trade, and other barriers. And then this last point is something that Andre commented on in his previous intervention. And it's really important to regulate, for instance, wildlife trade when thinking about this framework. And I think this underscores one of the key points that I'd just like to close by, suggesting that this framework is only as good as the knowledge that is incorporated within it. And so we need to make sure that the evidence-based, the science that we're drawing upon is accurate and empirically tested. And this will give the energy to this framework that's needed to move it forward and move countries onto a more sustainable.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for your valuable and insightful presentations. So let's get started with the questions and answers. Viewers, I encourage you to post your questions with name and country in the YouTube live chat session box. First, I'd like to ask to the speakers a few questions myself. So let me start with a question to Matthew. Actually, Matthew-san, talked about the waste management, and you also talked about several examples. But if possible, I'd like to ask you the following questions. Managing hazardous waste in the current COVID-19 era is essential. So can you give me some further details on the best practices in managing hazardous waste? Could I ask to Matthew-san?
Sure. Thank you, Endo-san, for that really very brilliantly framed question. I spoke a little bit about some best practices in terms of technologies, waste management technologies for the management of hazardous waste. But across many of the slides that I presented, I really wanted to emphasize the need for an enabling institutional environment to carry forward some of those technologies and better practices. So again, when we talk about SCP, we need to be talking about all stages of the waste management cycle, starting from generation through storage, transport, and disposal across the waste management supply chain. But really, when we talk about these institutional change that needs to take place, really what we're talking about is behavior change. Now, governments, whether they're national or local, can help to support some of the behavior change for, as I mentioned earlier, the necessity of improving the source segregation of the hazardous waste from, for example, healthcare providers. But this needs to be coupled with awareness campaigns together with appropriate incentives to support those kinds of behavioral changes. And this has to be led by institutions both at the national and local level. Having said that, this of course requires not only the active support from national and local authorities, but also collaboration with multi-stakeholders across multiple levels and sectors. Private sector is key, of course, in making sure that the technologies can be operationalized, whether we're talking about incineration, the upgrading of our sanitary landfill sites, or the autoclaves, the steam sterilization of the waste management, hazardous waste management. And of course, working together with our civil society partners to help ensure that those awareness raising campaigns can take place. Having said that as well, we need our financial service providers to support the infrastructure development and expansion of waste management technologies. But all of this needs to be packaged under a larger waste management strategy, whether at the local or national level, to ensure that waste management of the hazardous waste streams is handled in a holistic and integrated way. And I thank you.
Thank you very much for your very informative response to the question. Thank you very much. So next, I'd like to ask Andre about some kind of biodiversity issues. I think biodiversity is at the center of many economic activities, particularly those related to agriculture, forestry, and fisheries. So my question to Andre is, how can ensuring the maintenance of biodiversity play an essential role in meeting the Sustainable Development Goals in the wake of COVID-19? Andre, please.
Yeah, thank you, Endo-san. I think, first of all, it should be pointed out that out of the 17 SDGs, 2 of them are actually very specifically dedicated to biodiversity conservation. It's number 14 and 15. One of those is about aquatic biodiversity, especially marine biodiversity. Another one is dedicated to biodiversity on land. But apart from those 2, and there have been lots of studies and different tools and reports and all the rest of it that have reported on this, all of the SDGs are to some extent dependent on biodiversity. And I actually gave some indication of this earlier on when I spoke about the bundle of ecosystem services, call them. So that term, ecosystem services, is sometimes a bit difficult to grasp, and it has been reformulated as nature's contribution to people, for example, more recently. And also natural capital is a term which refers mostly to that, and helps people, I think, to understand, especially from a sort of a economic perspective, what it means, what nature means to the economy. So this basket of ecosystem services, or bundle of ecosystem services, that's provided by virtually any ecosystem varies according to the ecosystem. But if you take a forest, for example, that forest will provide, as we've seen very clearly in this discussion, will provide various different species as food and as medicine. And that's the reason why species are being sold in wet markets. Those are the two main reasons for species being sold in wet markets. But then at the same time, the forest, the diversity of species in the forest has been shown, at least in some cases, to act as a disease control mechanism by diluting the effect of viruses and other pathogens. So, for example, a way to demonstrate that is that if you had a particular species which carried a virus, and if that species were to completely dominate the ecosystem, then that would obviously be a problem, and it would increase the chances of spillover. And that dominance of a species happens when, or can happen when, a species is degraded. For example, when an invasive alien species takes over and displaces a bunch of other species. So there are lots of examples of this, but I wanted to just also go back to one that I mentioned earlier on, and that is the diversity of species as a whole. So not just in a particular forest, but in the entire world. They've been estimated, probably the most relied upon recent estimate is that there's somewhere between 8 and 9 million species in the world, most of which have not been described by science. And only a very, very tiny proportion of those have been investigated for their potential to, for example, be the source of medicines, but also various other kinds of technological innovation, whether it's in engineering or whatever it may be. And the point is that we have already used several thousands of these designs in nature, and even the materials that they produce. Specific species have specific combinations of genes, for example. But that what we do know about is just such a tiny proportion of what there is to know. So when we lose species, that means that we lose the potential to find out more, and that has implications across the SDGs, whether it's about poverty or hunger or job creation or whatever it may be. So this is I could talk on and on, as you can probably tell, but that I hope gives you some idea of how biodiversity conservation and the SDGs as a whole are related to each other.
Thank you very much for your comment from the very wider perspectives based on the SDGs. Thank you very much. So may I move on to the question to Eric? Actually, the APO member countries are very diverse in terms of population or economy, the stage of development, or of course the impact of COVID. So my question to Eric is, please explain how the 3R planning framework can be applied to different APO member countries while recovering from the impact of COVID-19. Eric, please. Eric, could you? Oh, just a moment, please. Ask Andre. Okay. So may I actually, Eric is a little bit have a connection problem. So maybe I may ask other question to Andre. Actually, you talked about the example of buffer zones in your presentation. If possible, could you give some concrete examples of idea of buffer zone and how they function?
Thanks, Anderson. To be honest, I don't know of any that have actually been applied yet. I think that they probably have, and I guess that the research is heading in that direction. The sort of reactionary research is looking at communities where spillover is most likely. There is one thing I can tell you is that there is an initiative called Invest, which has been going for many years. I think I don't remember what the startup date was, but it is a multinational initiative which looks at this kind of issue. And ironically, and this is just a little anecdote, but ironically, that initiative was shut down just before the COVID-19 pandemic really started hitting the news, and was sort of defunded because it was considered to not be particularly important. And this happened as a result of a certain government, which I won't name, but it has subsequently been promised by the likely new head of that state that the program will be reopened. And in fact, I think it already is underway. The reopening is already being funded. So this is a large-scale program looking specifically at this whole idea of spillover, and spillover is basically, it can be regarded as where the buffer zone is. So I don't have that's not a very specific example, but it's a program which aims to do exactly this, to identify which these areas are, where they are, and then to use them as early detection systems.
Thanks a lot. So thank you very much for your kind explanation. Or can I go back to the question to Eric? Eric, can you hear and can you hear us?
Yeah,
Eric?
I can hear you, Endo-san. Thanks so much.
Oh, so I'd like
me?
to ask you. Yes, okay, clear. Could you respond to the question as follows? Please explain how the 3Rs planning framework can be applied to different APO member countries while recovering from the impact of COVID-19. Eric, please.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for this important question, Endo-san. So what I'd like to highlight in responding is that the framework itself is flexible. And so when we apply it to different countries, the actual solution.
Okay, so Erickson again disconnected, so we may wait a little bit so that he can return to this session. So I'd like to ask next question to Matthew and to his second questions. So you talked about EU policies a little bit. So I think that the European countries are promoting so-called green recovery. So what are its implications for the Asia-Pacific region? Could you elaborate on this?
Yes, thank you again for the important question, Endo-san. Brilliantly put. I wish I had better news on this front. As we know, EU has passed a landmark green stimulus package, as mentioned earlier, that also indeed focuses on waste management. Recent findings have shown that very few countries within the Asia-Pacific are implementing green stimulus measures. Shocking statistic to find that countries as wide-ranging as Indonesia, Philippines, Taiwan, no green stimulus measures have been recognized or included. Even in fact, Australia, very close to 0% of stimulus funding has gone into green recovery, COVID-19 recovery packages. I'd like to provide a counterexample, though, in terms of South Korea. Some of our viewers may be familiar that South Korea has recently launched a Green New Deal as of July 2020. This is part of a much larger national strategy focusing on job creation and emphasizing recovery from the economic crisis resulting from COVID-19, and also seeks to address climate and environmental challenges. It's roughly about 61 billion over 5 years through the year 2025. Some relevant sectors will include renewable energy, green mobility, so that's transport through the promotion of electric and hydrogen-powered vehicles, and so on and so forth. So I think we can look to Korea as one of the leaders in the region in terms of the green stimulus that may inspire other countries to follow. And again, we can identify on the basis of this Green New Deal a number of viable sectors for the promotion of some of these recovery measures, which also would have, again, these positive knock-on effects for employment, green jobs, and the like. But again, just to underline the point I made before, this requires very much some strategic thinking, some collective action, and an enabling institutional environment working together with multiple partners and across multiple sectors and levels. So it is very much a long-term and holistic view. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Eric-san, could you respond to the previous question?
Yeah, let me try to respond to the previous question. So the point is that when we apply this 3 R's framework to different countries, the types of solutions you come up with might be slightly different. So let's take the issue of air pollution, for example. In many developing countries, the COVID lockdowns, while leading to a decrease in urban air pollution, especially in terms of NOx pollution from the has also led to an increase in indoor air pollution. And this is largely from the burning of biomass. Many of these countries rely on cook stoves for cooking and in some contexts heating. And when you have people sheltering in place, that means there's a greater indoor air pollution. So when to respond and then also into the recover elements, we need to think.
Okay. So maybe Eric will try later. So anyway, actually, we are almost running out of time. So we may wrap up today's session. So it was quite wonderful productivity talk with the 3 eminent speakers. Once again, I'm grateful to all of you. And I'd like to ask each of you to say some concluding remarks or some messages to the viewers, starting from Andre, next Matthew, if possible. I also would like to ask to Eric. So, Andre, could you start? Could you say something?
Sure. Thanks, Endo-san, for this last opportunity and for the opportunity as a whole. I think that perhaps if I had to give one elevator pitch message coming out of what I've discussed and what I've been reading since the crisis started, is that people ought to be careful about the consumption of information, and just, especially in this age of echo chambers, where what search and the way that our searches are channeled by search engines online depend on our previous searches. So if I search for something, it's not necessarily going to show the same thing as what someone else searches for. And what this means is that we have to be extra careful about which information is presented to us and which information we consider to be the truth, and to treat everything with a little bit of skepticism. So there have been lots of conspiracy theories and lots of misinformation as a result of the pandemic, and because of that, I think partly because of that, governments have even struggled to know how to respond to this. So I hope that all of this results in governments being able to respond, to learn and to respond a lot better next time. I think a lot of people have been quite surprised and concerned about how governments have struggled to respond, except in particular cases. And, and also this indicates the importance of learning from those relatively few cases where governments have really got it right and have really tackled this in the correct way. I think a lot of that boils down to the information, how we view the information and how we respond to the information, especially in the context of frameworks like this RRR.
Thank you. So next I'd like to ask Matthew.
Thank you so much. Yes, I'd like to echo some of the points made by Andre. In today's very hyper-accelerated world, I think it's incumbent on us to be able to understand, to think a little bit more critically about, the challenge and possible solutions, which were numerous and raised in today's presentation. And I think in closing, it's important to highlight that, we're living in an unprecedented time, but these challenges that we face are not new, and neither are the solutions. I mean, many of these have been discussed at length leading up to COVID-19 and now in the aftermath. And going back to the adage, never waste a good crisis, we really now have a window of opportunity to really set things right and start off on a more positive, resilient, and sustainable pathway. And by that, I think it's important for us to really consider how often we've talked about these opportunities for change, but now look at now we're at this critical juncture, how to really implement and operationalize those solutions. So I think a forum like this is a very good chance for us to exchange ideas and build upon what we already know. We have an evidence base. Let's move forward and let's build back better. Thank you.
Thank you for a very encouraging statement. So finally, I'd like to ask Eric to give us concluding remarks to our viewers. Eric, please.
Okay, thank you, Endo-san, and deep apologies for the technical difficulties, but I think some of the technical difficulties I'm experiencing underline some of the salient points that were raised during our discussion. That is to say that when we try to pursue new types of innovative and transformative changes, we need not only sort of technological innovation and some types of resources to support that change, but we also need a very good system in place. And unfortunately, I'm speaking from a system where I have a inconsistent signal on my Wi-Fi. So I apologize for that, but I think it illustrates the importance of systemic change as an important prerequisite for sustainable change. And just to underline, we believe that this triple R's framework, if situated well and interpreted flexibly in the right context, can drive transformative, sustainable, and resilient changes and turn what is obviously a tremendous tragedy into a pivot point in our development trajectory. And we look forward to working with colleagues from the APO and colleagues throughout Asia toward that end. Thank you so much, and really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much for your inspiring message. We really appreciate your time today. I'd also like to thank all viewers for joining us today. I'm sorry for the technical difficulties in the connection in this session. And the APO will continue to share information and ideas through productivity talks and other online digital platforms. Please subscribe to the APO channel if you haven't already. We look forward to seeing you again soon. In the meantime, stay safe and stay healthy. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care and goodbye for now.